In 1976, the unchallenged ruler of communist China died, leaving a nation built on absolute loyalty and fear teetering at the edge of chaos. Mao Zedong's policies reshaped 1 billion lives, with 30 million perishing in famine and millions more persecuted during the Cultural Revolution. Yet his sudden absence triggered not just a battle for power, but the unraveling of his own family's influence. How did the family and country of China's most feared leader navigate the aftermath? And why were Mao's ideals preserved while his legacy was quietly rewritten? The story begins where myth and reality violently collide. Mao Zedong began life as the son of a Hunan farmer, shaped by rural hardship and the chaos of a fractured China. By 1949, he led the Communist Party to victory, declaring the birth of the People's Republic in Tiananmen Square. Mao's doctrine, later known as Maoism, called for revolution from the countryside up, placing the peasantry at the heart of national transformation. His vision demanded total loyalty and constant struggle, turning ideology into the guiding force of daily life. Land reform campaigns in the early 1950s redistributed fields to 300 million peasants, breaking the old landlord class and promising a new order. The nation's literacy rate soared from 20% to 80% by the time of his death. Land reform and mass campaigns reshaped rural society and state power. In 1964, China detonated its first atomic bomb, joining the ranks of nuclear powers and signaling a new kind of independence. Yet at the foundation of Mao's rule stood the belief that personal sacrifice for the collective good was not just expected, but required. For millions, Mao's words became law, and his portrait watched over every home and school. Personal sacrifice and ideological commitment made the country's fate, and the fate of its people, inseparable from the will of one man. Mass campaigns under Mao reshaped China at a staggering human cost. The Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958, aimed to propel the country into industrial greatness, but instead triggered one of the deadliest famines in history. Between 20 and 45 million people died from starvation and malnutrition by 1962. Grain production collapsed. Rural families were forced to surrender their harvests, and entire villages vanished from the maps. In the cities, rationing lines stretched for blocks. In the countryside, parents buried children in unmarked graves. The Cultural Revolution, beginning in 1966, unleashed another wave of turmoil. Students rallied as Red Guards, brandishing copies of Mao's Little Red Book. They roamed streets and schools, denouncing teachers, neighbors, and even their own parents as enemies of the revolution. One former Red Guard later recalled that they worshipped him as a god, destroying their own families for the revolution. Over a decade, at least 1 to 2 million people died from violence or persecution, while 36 million more were publicly humiliated, beaten, or sent to labor camps. Intellectuals were forced to sweep streets, families were torn apart, and trust between generations shattered. These traumas lingered, shaping the lives of survivors long after the slogans faded from the walls. On the morning of September 9th, 1976, the news broke. Mao Zedong was dead. Inside Zhongnanhai, the leadership compound in Beijing, silence hung over the corridors. Mao's body, frail after months of heart and lung failure, lay surrounded by doctors and party officials. Outside, China paused. Factories, schools, and entire cities came to a standstill as the radio announced the passing of the man who had ruled for nearly 3 decades. But behind the public mourning, anxiety gripped the highest ranks of the Communist Party. Mao had left no clear successor. His last days were marked by whispered conversations, urgent notes, and a single message to Hua Guofeng. The words were, "With you in charge, I am at ease." Even so, Hua's authority was uncertain. The Politburo was split between radicals led by the Gang of Four and older revolutionaries who distrusted them. Every faction feared that a single misstep could trigger chaos or even civil war. In these tense hours, Hua Guofeng stepped forward as the provisional leader. His appointment was less a sign of strength than of compromise. He was seen as loyal to Mao, but not tied to any faction. In the days after Mao's death, the party's top brass moved quietly. Security forces increased their presence in Beijing. Rumors of plots and secret meetings spread through the capital. The question of who would control China and whether the revolution would devour its own hung in the air. Unanswered, the machinery of the state kept running, but the sense of certainty that Mao had imposed for a generation was gone. Just after nightfall on October 6, 1976, the leadership compound in Beijing became the center of a silent operation. Hua Guofeng, flanked by senior allies Ye Jianying and Wang Dongxing, gave the final signal. At precisely 10 in the evening, members of the elite People's Liberation Army Unit 8341 moved into position, their orders sealed and unambiguous. By 11 in the evening, Jiang Qing, Mao's widow and the most vocal of the Gang of Four, was detained in her Zhongnanhai residence. She hurled accusations, but no shots were fired. Within the hour, Wang Hongwen, Zhang Chunqiao, and Yao Wenyuan were also taken into custody at the Great Hall of the People. The arrests unfolded in near silence, the only sound the shuffle of boots on marble floors. No public announcement came until the following morning, on October 7, 1976. A terse bulletin from Xinhua declared that the counter-revolutionary clique had been smashed. Across China, the news spread quickly. The radicals who had dominated the final years of Mao's rule were gone. Hua Guofeng, now unchallenged, assured the nation that Mao's legacy would be honored through the two whatevers, a pledge to uphold all of Mao's policies and instructions. This formula, repeated in newspapers and radio broadcasts, calmed a party still raw from years of factional struggle. For the moment, order held. The coup was surgical, bloodless, and decisive. Analysts would later call it the moment China's future was pried from the hands of the radicals. One historian put it simply, without that night, reform would have been impossible. As the dust settled, the machinery of government began to move again, but the era of Maoist radicalism had ended in a single night. In late 1980, the Supreme People's Court convened a special tribunal in Beijing. Jiang Qing, Mao Zedong's widow and the most infamous member of the Gang of Four, sat in the dock flanked by armed guards. The courtroom brimmed with anticipation as state prosecutors read out charges of plotting to seize power, persecuting rivals, and inciting violence during the Cultural Revolution. Over weeks of televised proceedings, Jiang Qing refused to admit guilt. She spoke in clipped, defiant bursts, insisting she was merely carrying out Mao's wishes. Her voice echoed through the chamber. "I was Chairman Mao's dog. I bit whomever he asked me to bite." The spectacle gripped the nation. For the first time, ordinary citizens watched a leader's downfall unfold on screen. The evidence included party documents, witness testimony, and footage of public humiliations from years before. On January 25, 1981, the verdict landed. Jiang Qing was sentenced to death, though the court commuted her sentence to life imprisonment. The other gang of 4 members received lengthy prison terms. Jiang spent her remaining years behind bars, her appeals rejected. In 1991, she died by suicide in a hospital bathroom, leaving behind a legacy as both revolutionary and scapegoat. The trial closed the chapter on Maoist radicalism, signaling that the era of mass campaigns and those who led them was over. Away from the spotlight, Mao Zedong's surviving relatives found themselves living in the long shadow of his rule. Li Min, Mao's eldest daughter with He Zijian, withdrew into a quiet life in Beijing. She married Kong Linghua and for decades kept her distance from politics. Her days revolved around family and the careful routines of a state-provided apartment. Memoirs and rare interviews reveal a sense of pride mixed with resignation. Li Min once wrote that they cherished his memory privately. The privileges of her youth faded into modest pensions and constant surveillance, a reminder that the party's trust was never fully given. Li Na, Mao's daughter with Jiang Qing, also retreated from public life. Once a rising figure in the military and in propaganda, she spent her later years editing quietly and avoiding attention. Her marriage dissolved after her mother's arrest, and she lived under similar restrictions as her sister. In interviews, Li Na described her father's legacy as a bittersweet burden, acknowledging the isolation that came with his name. Mao's sons left even fainter traces. Mao Anying, killed in Korea in 1950, became a relic, his shirts and socks preserved by Mao for decades. Mao Anqing, plagued by illness, worked as a translator but never entered public debate. The only male line grandson, Mao Qinyu, later served in the People's Liberation Army, but without political weight. Nephew Mao Yuanqin, once a trusted aide, spent 17 years in prison after the purges. Released in 1994, he lived under watch, his former influence erased. For the family, the end of Mao's era brought not just the loss of power, but a kind of enforced silence. Their private world was shaped by memory, regret, and the unspoken costs of history. In the winter of 1978, a group of farmers in Xiaogang village in Anhui province gathered after dark to sign a secret pact. 18 men pressed their fingerprints in red ink on a handwritten contract, dividing the collective fields among their families. If they were caught, they faced prison or worse. But their gamble paid off. The following harvest, grain output in Xiaogang tripled. News of the experiment spread quietly from village to village, catching the attention of reform-minded officials in Beijing. At the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee in December 1978, Deng Xiaoping and his allies pushed for a radical break from the past. The party voted to end the era of mass campaigns, shifting focus to economic modernization. The household responsibility system, inspired by Xiaogang, swept across the countryside. By 1984, over 99% of rural households had adopted the new model. Grain production soared by a third in just 6 years, and rural incomes more than doubled. For the first time in decades, peasants could sell surplus crops at local markets, buy bicycles, and even repair their homes without state approval. In the south, planners drew up blueprints for a new kind of city. In 1980, Shenzhen was designated China's first special economic zone. Construction crews worked around the clock, building factories, roads, and apartment blocks on what had been fishing villages. Foreign investors arrived with cash and technology, lured by tax breaks and cheap land. Within a decade, Shenzhen's GDP multiplied 20-fold. The city's population exploded, drawing millions of migrants from across the country. Factory whistles replaced political slogans, and the rhythm of daily life shifted from struggle sessions to overtime shifts. Economist Barry Naughton described the change succinctly. He said Deng's reforms quietly buried Maoism, building modern China on pragmatism. The numbers told the story. In the 1980s, China's GDP grew at an average of 10% a year, compared to 2 or 3% under Mao. Ration coupons faded from daily life, replaced by open-air markets and newly stocked shops. The shift was irreversible. The country had traded ideology for growth, and the results could be measured in every bowl of rice, every new bicycle, and every city skyline stretching higher each year. By the early 1980s, daily life in China bore little resemblance to the world Mao had left behind. In the heart of Shanghai, a factory worker named Zhang Wei remembered the day ration coupons disappeared from his wallet. For decades, every meal, rice, oil, even tofu, had been measured out by the state. Shoppers queued for hours, clutching faded slips of paper, never certain what would be left on the shelves. Then, almost overnight, the coupons became worthless. Markets sprang up along crowded alleys, their stalls piled high with vegetables, pork, and even imported goods. For the first time in memory, Zhang could choose what to eat. Rations gone, markets bloomed. Life transformed overnight, he recalled in an interview years later. Across the country, similar stories unfolded. Incomes in rural areas doubled from 1978 to 1984, as farmers sold surplus crops and bought bicycles, radios, and sewing machines. Urban wages rose steadily, and the streets filled with new sounds, vendors calling out prices, children laughing on their way to newly built schools. The end of rationing meant more than just full stomachs. It signaled the arrival of choice, possibility, and a sense of control over one's own fate. Yet the changes were not felt equally. In the poorest provinces, entire families still lived on a few yuan a day, their homes patched with mud and straw. Official data from the early 1980s shows that more than 250 million people remained below the poverty line, even as national poverty rates began to fall sharply. The government tracked these numbers closely, eager to prove that reform was lifting the masses. By 1985, rural poverty had dropped by about 60%, but the memory of scarcity lingered. For many, the new era brought both relief and uncertainty. Old guarantees, jobs for life, fixed prices, state-supplied housing, gave way to competition and risk. Some thrived, opening small shops or joining factory assembly lines. Others struggled to adapt, their skills outpaced by the speed of change. Through it all, the rhythm of daily life shifted from political campaigns to the pursuit of a better future, one purchase, one opportunity at a time. In the center of Tiananmen Square, construction crews worked around the clock through the autumn of 1976. More than 40,000 workers mobilized from across the country, poured concrete, set marble, and installed crystal chandeliers under tight deadlines. The project's purpose was clear: to build a mausoleum that would enshrine Mao Zedong's body and with it the legitimacy of the Communist Party. Within just 8 months, the memorial hall opened its doors, drawing thousands of visitors each day. The embalming process, carried out with the help of Soviet and Vietnamese specialists, preserved Mao's remains in a glass sarcophagus, visible to all, a permanent reminder that the party's roots ran through one man. Yet, as crowds filed past Mao's body, the party's top leaders were quietly rewriting the rules. In June 1981, the Central Committee convened for a historic session. After weeks of closed-door debate, they issued the resolution on certain questions in the history of our party. The document, running more than 20,000 words, delivered a verdict that would shape China's future. Mao was declared 70% correct, 30% wrong. The resolution praised his role in unifying China and launching socialist construction, but condemned the excesses of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Deng Xiaoping and his allies pushed for this balance, arguing that only by acknowledging both achievements and mistakes could the party move forward without tearing itself apart. Textbooks and propaganda materials were swiftly updated. New directives instructed teachers to present Mao as the founding father, revered but human. Statues remained in city squares, and his portrait continued to gaze down from Tiananmen. Yet lessons now included sober accounts of famine and political violence. The party's message was careful. Mao's image would be preserved as the symbol of unity and revolution, even as many of his policies were quietly set aside. By safeguarding the founder's legacy, the party fortified its own claim to rule, preparing for the ideological battles that lay ahead. China's leaders still invoke Mao's image, even as they chart a path he never imagined. Today, his legacy remains both shield and sword, untouchable, yet selectively rewritten to serve the party's needs. In a nation where history is power, the struggle over Mao's memory shapes every debate about China's future. What is remembered and what is forgotten still decides who holds control. Share your perspective in the comments below.